Well, just to push back a little bit, and I'm not saying that, what he did was right or wrong, but just to push back a little bit, there's books about CRISPR, Nobel Prizes about CRISPR. Everyone's excited about CRISPR, and then a guy actually does it, and people get mad. it's kind of silly.
There are continued effects that ripple through humanity that are beyond that individual's consent.
Yeah. And again, we could also just call that natural genetic drift, right? Like every mutations happen.
I guess you could call it natural from the minute you push the first domino.
You might. Just at this very second, the right UV ray could be striking you and, changing a gamete,
for sure.
And you could have a child tomorrow with the exact, and it might, be more fit or less fit or.
Just a straight radiation.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of this. Very few people know I actually started a little natural language processing company in 2015 because my bottleneck was reading PubMed. And, I was in this arms race with my friend and competitor Vivek, who hired a big team of people to do the same exact thing. And we kept kind of paying people to sit there and troll through PubMed. And there's 35 million articles in PubMed. So it's sort of an NP complete problem, at least with humans. At the time, we brought IBM in and they showed us Watson, and I asked Watson what the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes was. It didn't do very well. And, the rest of the future happened, but I quit NLP. And then, Transformers came out. The woman who I'd marry, I at the time was studying them and was very early at a company called OpenAI. And now she's still there many years from now. And she was sort of the one person who knew anything about biology and medicine at the time. They were a very, very small company. So she pitched Bill Gates on some biology work that they did. And lo and behold, Microsoft did a deal with the company. So I think there's a lot of hope that LLMs can teach us a little bit about biology and teach us what lies beyond. Probably more in the, take the massive human knowledge that we built, 37 million disjointed papers, where the only person who could synthesize it all is some genius that can read really fast, which has, no matter how smart this person is, there's limits. Or an organization that could read really fast. And if you've ever been a part of a big medical university or company, that doesn't work very well. Or a machine. And the machine seems to be by far the best, choice. So the question is, using these machines, can we get some really great insights? I like to give this example of the BTK inhibitor. The BTK was well known to be a really important hematopoietic enzyme in the 80s. And it took 20 years for somebody to say, let me make a BTK inhibitor. And countless people died of lymphoma that could have been saved. But for the connection of these 37 million papers, and forming these inferences, we could get there. And I think, whenever the people at OpenAI or any other company ask me how is AI going to help medicine, I basically say it's not, and they say, well, what about these drug discovery programs that are AI powered? And I'm like, it's all hocus pocus. What we really need is better targets and better strategies. The medicine's there. We have all the chemistry, we have all the biology. We just need ideas, and those ideas are the kind of the important part that moves medicine. Is somebody stands up and says, I think IL-4 blockade will be great in asthma, and you get a Dupixent. And other people say, I think this thing will be great in that, and they're wrong. And, they spend a lot of money and that sucks. But, it's the idea generation that's the most important part of our industry. The chemists are important. I'm a chemist. The biologists are important. The assay people are important. The manufacturing people are important. But at the end of the day, unless somebody stands up and says, I have a therapeutic hypothesis, here it is. And up until now, the only therapeutic hypotheses that have ever been advanced have been by humans. And I did a fun thing with my girlfriend. My girlfriend and I wrote a for loop where we fed GPT basically every single protein. We said, okay, for I equals 1 to 20,000. She's a better programmer than me. What protein, when inhibited, what disease could this protein potentially, cure or alleviate or whatever. And you could run that for loop and just go through every single, theoretical, protein in the body and knock it down with an RNA or an antibody or small molecule or whatever. And, conceptually, that's kind of, all we've got to go on, right? Maybe there's medicine beyond proteins. For example, epigenetics, custom proteins, tons of different little modalities here and there. Certainly, epigenetics comes to mind, post-translational modifications, but, cell therapy, I don't know. But certainly starting with that and asking a super intelligence, I think Sam Altman talks a lot about, what would you do if you had the God machine? And, a lot of people say, gee, I don't know, I would solve the Riemann hypothesis. Well, as a math fan, I think that's a great idea. But as a humanist, which is about 1 minute of my day, every day around about 30 seconds, I have feelings. And I would try to think about maybe, would there be a good disease we could treat if you have the super brain, GPT-5 or GPT-6 or GPT-7 or whatever. Why not point the super brain at one of these diseases and say, super brain, what's the best way to treat Alzheimer's? And the super brain may say, I think the best way to treat Alzheimer's is it's really an autoimmune disease, and we should come up with an autoimmune modulator for the brain. And here's a couple of ideas. Here's a CXCR3 inhibitor. Here's a CD20, a small molecule. Here's a PD-1, small molecule protein-protein inhibitor, interaction inhibitor. And here you go, try these out. And 5 years later, you have the best Alzheimer's drug. So I think that's kind of the direction we're going. Anyway, I said a mouthful because I just like you, I have a lot to say and think about on this topic. I do think it's really exciting. But what do you think?
Wait, yeah, so you saying idea generation and discovery is the most important part. I agree with you there. Would you say it's entirely possible, let's say for a single person, individual, they come up with the idea, would it be possible for them to execute it and actually create the drug and maybe test it on a mouse entirely by themselves?
Very rare.
With things like cars and rockets, you can't do that because you need, team of engineers.
I'd say it's easier. I'd say it's easier with cars and rockets. So the problem becomes, so if you're an MD, PhD, or something like that at a teaching hospital, maybe you can get, the wet lab time, or it's your lab, you can do it and you publish it. And this is exactly what Vivek and I would troll sort of thousands of papers to find the one random hospital in the Czech Republic that did a great job with, in fact, the drug tenofovir was invented in the Czech Republic, and Gilead bought it for $1 million and turned it into a $100 billion company and changed the face of HIV at the same time. So, the problem is, you publish that paper and nobody cares. You presented it at a conference, nobody cares. And you sit there and, say, I need $10 million to do a real animal study or to file an IND. And, the university is saying, we don't have $10 million for you, and nobody else does either. And, you might get lucky and get one or two pharma tech transfer to pay a visit, but, you don't get the check. We were competing with Johnson & Johnson to do with Memorial Sloan Kettering, 𝗏𝗏 for treatment-resistant depression. And, that was like the greatest psychiatric advance in 30 years. And there was still just two companies kind of like half-heartedly kind of, interested in it. So it's tough, yeah.
So that's what you were doing with Vivek then? Basically, you're hiring interns and then essentially having them peruse through PubMed. Like
These were...
papers and looking for that one from the academic center that was actually real.
Vivek, I just wanted to answer that last point because I wanted to clarify. Vivek was a competitor. He was an investor in my first company, which did this. My second company as well was a sort of competitor. We didn't hire interns. We hired people, MD, PhD type people, paid them close to $1 million TC. So it was like, we had 20, 30 people each, and Pfizer and Novartis had like 5 people each. So we thought this was the biggest misunderstood thing in the world, and we still did think that, I think. But anyway, please go ahead.
So you know what a Pico question is, obviously.
Well, I know what Pico anything is, but what's a Pico question?
Yeah, like Pico, population intervention comparison outcome. It's the
okay.
acronym using a clinical question, right? So if you're going to do an evidence-based medicine approach, you come up with something called a Pico question. Pico question is like in, patients that have lymphoma versus don't have lymphoma, that's your population. Your intervention is a BTK inhibitor versus standard therapy. Your outcome is, whatever cell count you want to look at, for example. And that's your Pico question. You have an intervention, a comparison, and an outcome, basically. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Sure. Sounds like a scientific method to me.
Yeah, it's our acronym for clinical question formation. So, back in that same time period where you're doing NLP in 2015, I'm doing something similar. What I came up with was an automated Pico question generation, where you, let's say we have all 37 million PubMed papers. you define every variable across all 37 million as a population variable, an intervention variable, comparison variable, or an outcome variable, and then form every single question that's permutatively possible, and then assign the statistical methodology that's appropriate for it, depending on whether the independent or dependent variable is categorical or ordinal. And then you do a Bonferroni correction to look for family-wise error rate and just surface whatever is statistically significant, and then cross-reference it for clinical significance based on minimum clinically important difference. And literally just squeeze all the juice out of the data set, out of the entire world data set as fast as humanly possible with this technique.
It's like it's like GWAS for GWAS for published work.
Yes, you got it. And for registries and for large healthcare data sets. You know, I pitched this to the White House in 2020, and it's exactly what you described. Everybody's like, oh, that's amazing, but like, we don't really care. Like, no one really cares. I'm
a market guy, so at the end of the day, like, the easiest solution here is just Eli Lilly or Merck says, oh, we need to use this. And they write a check to my girlfriend's wonderful company, and before you know it, they use this tool or the rival or Google's tool or whatever, and they create the next new great drug for Parkinson's or whatever. And I think that's probably the best way it goes. And what's funny about this is I remember when GPT-2 came out and you could talk to it, and it was not great, but it was interesting. And basically OpenAI didn't want to make ChatGPT. They said, we're making an API, you can tap into it, we're not a product company, we're not here to make chatbots, we're not here to make software, we're here to just research AI. And then they said, all right, let's, nobody's building the tool that we expected. We gave you the API, gave you everything on a silver platter. All you had to do was just connect it to like a HTML box, and you would have had it. And they said, no one's doing this, so we're going to do it. And then they one of the most popular pieces of software ever. So they wanted to do it. But I think that the moral of the story is that, it might have to be one of these AI places that says, okay, we're going to have to do drug discovery, because if you know the Mercks and Pfizers and you've ever worked at some of these places, things don't change quickly. Pharma, one of the reasons I don't want to be in the pharma industry anymore is it's a very stultifying place. People like Vivek are extremely big change makers, that they're doing things way different. The pharma world is like very entitled and monopolistic, like we have a way of doing things, we're not going to change it. Vivek sort of turned a lot of things upside down. A lot of people didn't like it. And, it's just a very sleepy old culture. There's a lot of young people in tech. They do things very differently, move fast and break things. It's a very different world. You can't do that necessarily in pharma. But, this idea of saying, okay, how about a company where the central hypothesis of what drugs we advance is decided by AI is a really good idea. And I think that, your point of like, okay, how do you orchestrate this in this like interesting matrix, multi-dimensional matrix, is a really good way to do it too. I think you could do it either way and see which way works best. But I do think the idea of like somebody sitting at Biogen and saying, I really like neurology. I know a lot about neurology. I'm going to tackle this disease because I'm Mr. Neurology. And the problem is, you don't know if that guy's an alcoholic. You don't know if that guy's, has hubris. You don't know if that guy has, he's gotten one lucky drug right, so now he's got a huge budget, and he's going to get them all wrong. You sort of have human fallibility to deal with. And, this is the reason Wall Street was taken over by the quantitative investors. 9 out of the top 10 hedge funds are quants. And, the machines do a better job. And it's just very hard to deny. And, at some point, there's 8,000 drug companies. One of them is going to be run by a machine, and slowly but surely it's going to, well, of course the humans will do the experiments, but slowly but surely I think that the machine run drug company beats the human run drug company, just as the machine run hedge fund seems to beat the human run hedge fund. And again, the machine's a tool. It's not an adversary. It's not like some anthropomorphic like evil. It's just another tool that we do our job with. And that's, there's nothing to be scared of for that.
Would you say that you and Vivek, that the big thing, like 99% of the gains, it came from that idea of hiring 20 to 30 MD PhDs, whereas these Pfizers, whatever, they only had 5, and then having them full-time sifting through papers on PubMed, looking for that one gem from an individual researcher?
Yeah, the bid-ask spread basically was the average university or failed drug company or whatever wants $1 million for a drug, and that's the bid. and the ask for a working drug is like billions of dollars. And in fact, Vivek did a tremendous transaction where he bought a bunch of drugs from Pfizer for 100 mil and sold them to Roche less than a year later for $6 billion. So one man's trash was certainly another man's treasure. And, we just did this over and over and over again. It wasn't hard. Pfizer had all these failed drugs, and Merck and Bristol and all these guys. And we took a drug from Bristol, my company, that we paid $2 million for, and we got FDA approval. So with a brand new disease, first ever in its class, et cetera. So it's just the biggest mispriced asset market. You look at stocks all day, you're trying to figure out if Pfizer's worth 24 or 25, but then you look at a drug and you're like, this thing could be worth $10 billion. And
just to make sure I have the flow right,
yeah.
So the academic individual researcher, they discover, create the drug, and then they sell it to you guys for $1 million, and then you develop it a little bit further up to the point where it's maybe worth $100 million. So maybe you run phase 1 trial, and then you pass it off to Pfizer, and then they make you sell it to them for billions, and then they take it throughout phase 3 and onwards. Is that correct?
No, there's lots of different configurations. I mean, we took our drug all the way to FDA approval, and the company still sells it today. Vivek did that many times as well. Sometimes the pharmas never bite, they just never bite. And the other thing I'd correct is that it's not always some small university or something. It's oftentimes a drug company that, for example, yeah, they Amgen might just say, we're not doing psychiatry anymore. They shut down 20 good psychiatry programs. They say, we just decided not to do psychiatry. Sorry. And it's like, anybody wants a psychiatry drug. Here you go.
Well, how do you know those buried assets exist if you're not in the company themselves?
Patents, trials, papers, word of mouth. You build a network. People that used to work at Amgen. This drug's coming up for license.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's say you find the drug, then what's the next? Let's say you find the buried asset. What's the next step after that?
I mean, you start a business. It's a business now.
Practically speaking, what would you
depends.
do? Would you literally take the drug
trial.
and test it more extensively in animals, or would you test it in a human?
It depends. Depends on what the pharma had done. If the pharma last left off, in a certain place, then whatever you need to do to get to the next value inflection point, whether that's a phase 3 or you got to go rework some toxicology, or you got to manufacture more drug, which is often. So in any event,
so you're just picking up the academics work, and you're just taking it forward a little bit farther, because the academic, they just don't have the resources to do it, and they can't communicate it well enough to the point where anyone would give them a chance. Right,
exactly. You need buy-in, and even it's funny because one of the dynamics that's really fun is that, let's say there's a drug, let's take Viagra at Pfizer, and you do the drug, you develop the drug for cardiovascular disease, it doesn't look promising, you pull the plug. Let's say you're the guy, the program lead, you go to your director, or maybe even the CEO of the company, and you say, I want to do it for erectile dysfunction. And the CEO says, so let me get this straight. You just lost us $50 million on this cardiovascular thing, and you want to take this dog of a drug, and you're asking me for another $50 million. And it takes a lot of guts to be that person that says yes. Most people say, crawl in a hole and say, oh, I hope I don't get noticed because I lost $50 million. So sometimes some of these drugs have been in 4 or 5 autoimmune diseases, and it turns out that and they don't work for any of those, and then, oh wow, actually this is the best drug ever for Sjögren's. I hate that. I hate saying that thing. Or sarcoidosis or something like that. And there's no drugs for those diseases. And one of the reasons is just somebody at Roche or Pfizer or Merck doesn't want to say, I need another $25 million to do the Sjögren's. Sjögren's. It's like Sjogren's. It's like the hardest word in medicine to pronounce.
Like 25, 50 million, these are huge numbers. What do those expenses go to? Obviously the reagents, if you were to break
clinical trials. They're all clinical trials.
Okay, but in terms of developing with the discovery process, just creating
these drugs,
how expensive would you say that would be?
These drugs almost always already exist, so it's all clinical trials, but
They exist and they've been tested on animals and everything.
Yeah, they've usually been tested on humans already too.
Okay, let's say for the clinical trials, what's the most expensive part there? Is it like hiring the doctors to conduct the trials?
Yeah, CRO. The CRO does it for you, but the CRO goes and does all the paperwork and opens up every study site and pays the doctors and the site for doing the trial, collecting all the data, writing the protocol.
Does it have to be like an MD, a doctor, to do the clinical trial, or can it be like a nurse or nurse practitioner?
It's a very, very rigorous, process. Everything has to be documented very carefully.
Okay, so it's not just like the MD, because I'm thinking about like approaching this from first principles. Like, would it be enough to just have an MD and let's say they're well versed in like all parts of the all parts of the process? Can they just handle it all themselves?
Well, you got to file an IND too, and you have to file something with the FDA, and the FDA usually gives you something called study may proceed letter.
Right,
so,
but you can have AI do all of that paperwork.
Yeah, FDA usually wants to meet with you, kick the tires a little. It's not.
So say like FDA wanted to meet, and I'm just one person, one MD. Is that convincing enough, or do they like require a bunch of NPCs to be there?
Yeah, they don't mind having some NPCs. Again, that's why this industry is what it is. I mean, you have a very old way of doing things. Somebody like Vivek or myself shows up and says we're going to change everything. It's not something people like. It's something that people, again, it's a lot of old line thinking in this space. New thinking isn't necessarily that welcome. It's a very clubby oligopoly that hasn't grown very much.
Well, maybe with this administration, they'll be open to change.
Yeah, I think so.
One more question, I have to go afterwards. But in terms of your relationship with Vivek, so you guys were competitors back in the day. Did you ever work together?
Yeah, so he was in the hedge fund business. So was I. I started a drug company that he invested in, and the company did really well. And he left the hedge fund industry to start a drug company that did largely the same kind of stuff. I think we both shared this idea, and we weren't the only ones, by the way. I mean, there are many, many people in pharma that realized that the trash of many drug companies and universities is actually treasure.
So Vivek was at a hedge fund. He started this like bio thing, and then you invested in it. And then when it started,
Jesus Christ, no, backwards. No. So yeah, I started. Okay. That's right. He was at a hedge fund called QVT, and he was very good at what he did. I had wrapped up my hedge fund efforts and started a drug company. He invested in the drug company. It did very well.
Was it the first time you ever got into bio?
I'd been trading, investing biopharma companies for the last 15 years before then. But yeah, it was my first ever drug company. I was 28.
So you're trading bio companies at the hedge fund that you're working at full time, and then you started your own drug company.
Bingo.
And then Vivek invested in it.
Correct.
As part of his hedge fund.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, cool. This is it's very interesting, very helpful.
Yeah.
Changed the way I think a little bit, but should do more of these. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Well, Sarepta is about to report earnings, so I'm going to go attend to that. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you haven't heard, the FDA has hired a new curmudgeon that is going to stop all drug approvals and require p-values of 0.0001 with outcome studies for everything. Only overall survival will be accepted. So good luck, everybody.